The specific lesson that we're in right now in our discipleship class is looking at learning to obey. As disciples, we are to be an obedient people. And we talked about as we got into the lesson, and it's been a few weeks now, but maybe you remember some of these questions we discussed. There are different ways in which we can obey. You think about how it is that we may do everything that's asked, but may have an improper motive in how we go about it. And so that's one way that we could obey, but then of course on the other hand, well, we can obey and do what we're asked out of a good heart. And that's the type of obedience we as disciples ought to have. We referenced Romans chapter 6 verse 17, and we obey from the heart that form of doctrine. And that's the obedience that we as disciples need to have, that we need to learn. And so we talked about why should we obey Jesus. Of course, there were several good thoughts that went along with it, but at least the three we discussed based on the PowerPoint is that Jesus has all authority, He is Lord, and we obey Him out of our love and respect for Him. First thing we talked about, at least in learning how to obey, is that we've got to learn how to listen. And so we listen so that we can learn, not to prove ourselves right, not to prove anybody else wrong, but we listen so that we can learn, and that means we listen to everything Jesus has to say. Even if it's something that might be a little bit uncomfortable for us to hear, as disciples wanting to be obedient, learning how to listen means we listen to all of it. And then, of course, that last point we talked about with it is to listen for truth and salvation instead of ease and validation. Easy to listen to things that we are already doing correctly. It's easy to listen to things that we already know and understand, but it's much harder to listen to that might show I need to make a change in my life. But as disciples, that's the type of lessons that I want. That's what I need to hear. That's what I need to listen to so I can learn how to better obey. This is where we had left off in our last class together, thinking about obedience and how learning to obey means that I need to trust in God. And we talked about this thought of trusting in God and in God alone. What was it that got the Israelites in trouble time and time and time again through their history? They were disobedient because they didn't always trust in God and in God alone. You look at it, it's interesting in the prophets how often it is we see the prophets talking about how essentially they make it seem as if the children of Israel never actually just trusted God and God alone. There was always an element of Israel that trusted God and God alone, but overall, there was always a problem with idolatry. Well, who was it in the land that would worship idols? The heathens, the pagans, the Canaanites, the people who did not trust in God and God alone. And so the Israelites continually found themselves in trouble because while they might believe an aspect or trust an aspect of God, well, they also trusted something about the false gods of the land as well. And with that, as far as our application, we talked at least about money. You think about Matthew 6:24. We talked a little bit about how even for Israel at times the problem was they trusted in physical strength and in numbers and in military might. And of course we can do the same thing still today. And so that's at least a little bit of what we discussed. And that brings us up to where, yes?
You got to throw in there too, one of the ways we show we don't trust is our counsel today.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of the Word of God, we seek the writings of men. Instead of Christian brothers, we'll go seek the advice of a worldly friend rather than and that's really just showing a lack of trust.
And that's a good thought there. If you didn't hear, talking about another way we can see this place where sometimes we don't always just trust in God and Him alone is where we go for counsel. Who are we looking to? Who are we talking to? What books are we reading? Or are we simply going to God, going to His Word, seeking wise advice from those who are going to keep pointing us back to God's Word? And so that's a good thought, and I think in that, we might think back to, who is it, Saul and the witch at Endor? That whole idea there, he goes to the wrong place. And so that's a great thought. Johnny?
I was going to say, too many times, instead of allowing God to help us through His guidance and commands, we try to help him by doing
Yeah,
it our own way.
we think that we can do it better at times. And sometimes it's a genuine and honest thing that we're doing in that. And we'll talk a little more about that here in just about right now. And so the next thought that I had on this actually with trusting in God is that we need to trust God above past experiences and present emotions. And it's especially in the present emotions, Johnny, I think it gets to maybe the thought that you have there, where sometimes we kind of try to jump ahead of God and do things how we think it ought to be done or how we think that He would like it, but not actually going to see, well, but what does He want from us? And so we need to learn how to trust God above our past experiences and our present emotions. But this can be a real challenge. And it was a real challenge for the Israelites, really through all their history as well. Let's look at a couple passages on this. Let's go to Jeremiah 11. Jeremiah chapter 11. And we'll notice, at least from a few of these passages right now, how it is that more than anything, our emotions can keep us from doing what is right. Jeremiah chapter 11. And somebody read for us when you get there, verses 6 through 8.
Then the Lord said to me, proclaim all these words in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, saying, hear the words of this covenant and do them. For I earnestly exhorted your fathers in the day I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, until this day, rising early and exhorting, saying, obey my voice. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but everyone followed the dictates of his evil heart. Therefore I will bring upon them all the words of this covenant, which I commanded them to do, but which they have not done.
So what did God want the people to do?
Obey.
Obey. But what did the people do? They obeyed, but what did they obey?
Their evil heart.
Their evil heart. They were trusting in their heart. They were trusting in what felt right in the moment. They were trusting in their emotions and in their experiences. And the problem with that is you can't always trust your heart in that way. For the people of Israel, their heart was an evil heart. Go to Jeremiah chapter 17. Jeremiah chapter 17. And let's have somebody read verse 9.
The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?
Of course, you go down into verse 10 and you see, well, it's the Lord that knows our heart. He's the one that searches the mind. He searches the heart. He knows these things. But without Him, can we really trust our heart? If we don't have His wisdom and His guidance, can we really trust our own hearts ourselves? No. You see, it talks about in, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Timothy, where it talks about those whose conscience has been seared like a hot iron. And the conscience was seared because they'd done evil so long, so continually, that they no longer really had a good conscience to help guide them. Conscience is a good thing for us as long as our conscience is directed by the right things. So if we're in God's Word and we're studying it, we're reading it, we're meditating on it, we're letting it take root deep in our heart, then a lot of times our conscience is going to help guide us in the right direction. Now, that's not anything mystical. It's not anything out of the ordinary, because really, what is it that's guiding us still at that point? Is it not God's Word that we've let take root deep in our heart, that we've studied, that we know, that we read, that we understand, that we meditate on? And so if we're not doing these things, what's the state of our heart going to be? You can't trust it. Yet so many want to trust in their heart. They want to trust in their own experiences and trust in their own emotions for whatever it is that's going on. But it's a sure way to lead to devastation. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs chapter 16. And let's look together at Proverbs chapter 16 and have someone read verse 25. So a lot of times there's something that seems right, it feels right, we think surely it has to be right, but is it right? There's a way that seems right to man, but its end is death. If we're going to be obedient as disciples, we cannot trust our own experience. We cannot trust our own emotion. Who is it that we have to trust in? In God and in God alone. Can anybody think of any examples that we find, Old or New Testament, where we see a group of people or certain individuals maybe trusting in past experience or present emotion that gets them into trouble? Let's go Jesse, and then we'll go to you, Andy.
David gets upset at God when Uriah, or one of the new guys, touches the ark out of ignorance.
Right. Yeah, so David and Uzzah, and I had that down a little bit further in my notes. I think that's going to be 2 Samuel 6 maybe. Yeah, 2 Samuel 6 is where it is actually that we see that with David and Uzzah. But you remember in that particular context, the Israelites were trusting in past experience because they were moving the ark back in the way the ark had come back to them from the Philistines on the cart with the ox. But is that how it was supposed to be? No. We might think, okay, well, that makes sense. That's more efficient. You put it up there. No one has to touch it at all. But what happened in 2 Samuel 6? Cart starts to tip over. Uzzah reaches out to touch it. Is anyone to touch the ark? No. Seems like a little thing. If we were in Uzzah's shoes, we very likely would have done the same thing because you don't want the ark to fall and hit the ground. So you reach out to hold it and to stabilize it. But it's not what God wanted. Seemed right. I'm sure it felt right. But was it right? No.
You have good intentions.
But good intentions don't always make it correct. And that's one of the things, going back even to something Johnny mentioned earlier, and how sometimes we kind of get ahead of God because we think we're doing what's right. We think we're doing what he would want. We know God wouldn't want the ark to fall and hit the ground. Uzzah knows that. But to your point, good intentions don't make it right. Just because we may be genuine in what we do doesn't always make it right. Andy, you had another example?
Nadab and Abihu.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know exactly what their error was, but I'm sure whatever it was, they were thinking that it was going to be pleasing God, in their opinion, more so than what they were told to do.
Mm-hmm.
And yet God was not satisfied. They were consumed by fire.
Yeah, Leviticus chapter 10 with Nadab and Abihu. And there are some different thoughts there, and I like how you recognize we don't know exactly what's going on. We know they offered this profane, this strange fire that was not commanded by God. But there's a lot that's going on in Leviticus 10. Very possibly you have Nadab and Abihu who are sitting here thinking, this is a huge day. This is a big deal. We're able to make these sacrifices, to do this offering and give it to God. And yeah, you know, we've been given this little bit of instruction, but surely God would want more than that. It's very possible Nadab and Abihu did not mean anything harmful, or they weren't malicious in what they were doing in that offering. Very possible that they're just simply trying to offer up maybe a little bit more, to make it a little more exciting, a bigger event that day. But was it what God wanted? You can't trust in your own emotions.
So today, we see that in any form of unauthorized worship.
And we're gonna get to that in just a little bit.
I can't think of any that did not begin with what somebody thought was a good intention.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, keep the thought in mind because we're gonna get there here in just a moment. Let's go. I saw Jared's hand, and then I'll go with you, Dina.
When it comes to emotion, the prophets quite often respond in emotion, but then are corrected by God. Jonah, Elijah, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Many times you see Jeremiah pouring out his heart, thinking maybe God's way is not the best way, and maybe God needs to handle it this way, and then quickly corrected, by the instruction of God. And I think part of it, you think about how our emotions sometimes get the best of us, and they can become become a stumbling block. We don't like to be put in an uncomfortable position. And all of a sudden, we're trying to reach somewhere to get out of that uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
And it kind of guides us. That goes back to the heart, trying to lead us in a different direction.
And it goes back to why this is such a challenge, because we are emotional beings. Now, some of us are going to be more emotional than others, and that's just the way we're wired, and that's fine. But whether we're, really geared that way or not, we are emotional beings, and there's no way around it. And to Jared's point, there are certain times in which we maybe know that, okay, if I do this, if I speak the truth, it's going to be a pretty uncomfortable situation, so maybe I can just kind of avoid it entirely. Sometimes it's that emotion that's telling us, surely this has to be right. This can't be wrong. This is something that it wouldn't be like this if I weren't supposed to do it. Can you trust the emotion? No. And we think about even Jesus coming in, and I saw your hand there, Paul, and also yours, Miss Martha, so I'll get to y'all after Dina. But you think about the emotion and how we're emotional beings. Think about Jesus. Was Jesus a man like we are? Was Jesus an emotional being? Yeah, John 11:35, Aaron mentioned Jesus wept. Think about Jesus praying in the garden the night that he's betrayed. I'd say Jesus was an emotional being, right? Right. He goes in and drives out the money changers out of the temple. But did Jesus let his heart be the thing that guides him? No. Think back again in his prayer in the garden. If there's any other way, nevertheless, your will be done. He didn't let his emotion be his guide. Trusted in God and in God alone. Dina?
The biggest example I was thinking of is Saul. Before he was converted to Paul, everything he was doing persecuting Christians, he believed what he was doing was right, and he did it sincerely. But he wasn't right with God or correct with God until he actually listened, to what Jesus told him to do and changed.
Yeah, great example. He's trusting in what it is he knew at the time, and he was genuine in that. He was sincere in the persecution he was bringing on the church, and he says he did it in all good conscience before God. But then he learns the truth, and he's confronted with a situation. Do I trust my past experience? Do I trust those teachers before who guided me in that way? Or now confronted with the truth, do I trust God, and do I trust him alone? Great example to bring up. I'll go Paul and then Miss Martha.
Mankind values plus evaluation on everything they see. Gold's better than silver, or a tree's better than the earth as far as valuation. Blue's a better color than red, or whatever the case, and that sounds silly, but if it mattered to God, God created everything. Everything has the same valuation. Doesn't matter, you can say he values the earth or dirt the same as he values gold. Because he does, because he created all elements that he created. But man puts a valuation on that, so this is better than that, these are better than those. And so if it mattered, and even like the rainbow, well, if blue wasn't important or one of those other colors wasn't important, he would have left it out of rainbow because it wasn't created by him. So therefore, every color, every facet, every element, everything is in his creation that you see, even the rainbow. So as silly as it sounds, all colors matter, and they're all valued the same. But mankind, they think that, well, they know better than God, so therefore they put different valuations on all the things that they see, and that's what messes up and confuses.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you kind of get into that, and it was making me think of some stuff I've been looking at recently, but that's one of the challenges when it comes to atheism, or even really agnosticism, you could say, is that you have this situation where if I do not believe that there is a supreme being, a creator over all, or if I just simply don't know, what reason do I have to place actual value on anything? What reason do I have to look at every individual around me as being important, as being valuable? Because if I don't have that, and I'm not looking at it from recognizing God is my creator, but he's the creator of everyone. He's the one who created this world. Everything that he did and created matters. If I don't see it from that perspective, all I'm going to care about is me, 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 me. And so getting then to this thought of trusting God above the experience and emotion, if I don't actually recognize God as being supreme and being creator, my emotion and my experience is always going to be skewed, because I'm not going to be seeing it from his perspective. I'm not going to be valuing things as God would have me to value them. Thank you for that, Paul. Miss Martha?
Proverbs 15:7 says, "The lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the heart of the fool does not do so."
And that's, yes, Proverbs 15 and verse 7. And so recognizing...
It says, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight."
Yes, ma'am. And that goes into Proverbs 15 and verse 8. And recognizing in that, especially in that verse 8, just because you go through the motions doesn't make it acceptable to God. You have to have the right heart in it. And of course, the only way we can have the right heart is by going to God and his word. We'll go with Aaron and then Mark, and then I have a few thoughts here that we'll get to. Aaron?
Well, that was the Nazis' defense in the Nuremberg trials, was that they were just following the law.
Yeah, the law of the land.
If you take God out of the equation, then what were they doing wrong if they were just following the law? But the defense that ultimately persecuted them was that they were going against God. You know,
There's a moral
law that killing others is bad. And so that was what eventually got them all persecuted, was God's ultimate moral law. And even though not everybody wants to accept it, but that when it's all said and done, that reigns supreme. No matter where. You're right. And so that was what ultimately persecuted the Nazis, when they were saying, hey, we didn't do nothing wrong, killing all these people. That we were just following the law. You can't blame us for following the law. They said, no, there's a higher law than what that we're going to hold you to. And I think that's the world over. Everybody, no matter what you claim that you are, everybody knows there's a moral law that's built into us by God.
Because without that, what's the reason? What's the purpose of doing good if really there is no moral higher law to that? Absolutely. Mark?
Yeah, I just thought about, I'm sure plenty of us have friends or family who are religious, and they seem like, good people. But whether or not they seem like good people, and whether or not, they're genuine in their efforts, doesn't make it right. And one argument that I've heard so many times is about how we worship with singing. A lot of people, they want to use instruments, and their argument is, well, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I'm worshiping better than I would with just my voice. It's like, well, that's not exactly what Ephesians 5 says. And it's not the authority God gives us to worship with. So,
and some of that goes back a little bit to what Andy brought up with Nadab and Abihu, where if we think about it from the perspective of perhaps what they're trying to do is make it a bigger scene that day, put more into it, the emotions there in that. And really that's what that type of an argument is getting to. It's an emotional argument. It makes me feel good. It sounds better. I don't sing that well. It's just more pleasant to the ears. Okay, that may be the case from a human perspective, but are we to trust our perspective or God's perspective? And I had another thought on some of that with the instrumental music we'll get to as well here in just a moment. A couple of examples I thought of, and y'all hit on several of the ones that I had, is I think about Exodus chapter 32 with the children of Israel. After it is, they've come out of the land of Egypt. They've already crossed the Red Sea. They're out in the wilderness. Moses has gone up on Mount Sinai. Moses is receiving the law from God. All the while, what are the children of Israel doing down at the base of the mountain? They're building an idol, right? They're making the golden calf to worship the golden calf. Where do we think they got the idea for the golden calf? Back in Egypt, trusting past experience. It's very possible that within that, they're not necessarily saying that it's not trusting in God, but they're thinking about the idea of God and gods, rather, coming out of Egypt. Think about Joshua 24:15. You can worship the gods your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt, right? And so the recognition there was idolatry going on that was influencing them. Past experience and their present emotion. Another place that I had thought of, at least going to the New Testament, is think about Peter's reaction in Matthew 17. Matthew 17, the beginning of that chapter where you have Jesus going up, being transfigured there. And remember, who is it that appears alongside Jesus on the top of that mountain? Moses and Elijah. And what's Peter's reaction to seeing all of that?
Build a place for all of them.
Oh, it is great to be here. Let's go ahead, let's build some tabernacles, let's build these little tents. That way we can have one that's, dedicated to Moses. We'll have one for you, Jesus. We'll have one for you, Elijah. It seemed right in the moment, but what did God say about it? No. Peter looks up, Moses and Elijah are gone. Who's he see left? Jesus. This is my beloved Son, hear him. Past emotion, or rather present emotion, past experience does not justify. One more example that will kind of transition us then into the next thought that gets to some of what Mark had mentioned and where my dad was going earlier as well. Think about Moses and bringing forth water for the children of Israel out in the wilderness. Exodus 17 is the first place we see this where they need water. And what does God tell Moses to do to a rock? First time he says, strike it, right? Take the rod, strike the rock, water will come forth. The second time, when you get to Numbers chapter 20, that's when God says, speak to the rock. But Moses does what? He strikes the rock. Just because it was right before doesn't make it right in the present. Past experience, present emotion is not to be my guide. I need to trust in God and in God alone. And with that, then, I need to quit making excuses. So often when it comes to our obedience, we can find every reason possible to try to say why I can't obey. Oh yeah, I can obey all of these things over here, but when it comes to something that I really want to hold on to, when it's something that's challenging for me, I'm going to try to find every way within the book possible to say, yeah, but I don't have to do that right there. That doesn't apply to me. Obedience means we have to stop making excuses, which means other situations cannot justify my excuses. And this is what I was thinking of when it comes even specifically thinking about the musical instruments, because of how a lot of times people will look to the Old Testament. So Mark, you recognize the emotional arguments that are made a lot of times toward it. And Dad, I think where you were going earlier with thinking about some of the things that happen in the religious world that are genuine, sometimes perhaps it's because of past experience. How many times when it comes to using instruments in worship do we hear individuals say, well, they used it in the Old Testament?
David said to use it.
Right, David said so back in the Psalms. Just because it was right under the old, does it make it right under the new? No. Again, think about Moses. Great example to show that even within the Old Testament. Just because something was authorized at one point in the past does not always make it so in the present. We might think about Matthew 19 as Jesus is teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Of course, you think about what's asked concerning, well, why did Moses permit this? Okay, maybe it was permitted by Moses under the Old Testament, but does that make it so under the New Covenant? Does that make it so today? No. We recognize what God's law is. We trust in Him and in Him alone. May be hard when it comes to overcoming experience and emotion, but that's what it is that we as disciples must overcome. We cannot make excuses by saying, well, if it was right for them back then, it must be right for me now. That doesn't mean anything. Jesse?
It was right for them to take their children out to the swear and stub them if they were being disobedient.
Yeah, we don't want to do that though, right? You know, and if we want to learn from past experience, if we really want to follow their example, we learn as well from the prophets. They kind of went a step further than just taking them and stoning them in the square. Because of their influence from the pagan world, they were even going and sacrificing their children to false gods. Something we don't always look at, something we don't always think about. But you really want to follow old examples, why don't you just go ahead and follow them all the way to that? That's where it leads eventually. Johnny, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, God had told them, even under the Old Testament, to take away their instruments.
Mhm.
They've become nothing but noise.
Mhm. Right. And so we can recognize even through all of that, I mean, it's not what God's ultimate intent all along was. But so often we'll try to find those old situations to justify our present excuse or our present emotion or our present experience, but that's not something that we as disciples need to be doing. Another thing that we'll do, Aaron?
I was just going to play the other side and say, but it makes me feel good.
And that goes back to Mark's comment earlier,
But
the emotional argument.
God wants me to feel good,
And
doesn't
and
he?
Aaron, I'd point you back to the, can you read
Just
the,
checking.
trust God above past experience and present.
All right, thank you. Just checking. Make sure we're on the same page.
Another way that sometimes we try and excuse some of our disobedience is by pointing to what I did do that's right. Right? We'll say, well, okay, maybe I didn't do that, but you know, you look over here and I have this that I did good. I helped someone. I called someone. I showed up for them. I did this. I did this. I did this. I did this. And there's more on this side over here that I got right than this over here. Or we think because I did these three things right over here, then that justifies me to just do this one thing over here that's not right. Is that going to cut it as disciples? No. Paul?
I always go back to Exodus 20, verse 25, when it's talking about telling Moses and them about building the altar. It said, if thou wilt make an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if thou lift up thy tool against it or upon it, thou hast polluted it or profaned it. And, you know, you read that and like, it's kind of like, you know, for example, Mark used instrumental music, you know, like, you didn't, the problem is man thinks they can impress God or do something better than what God has created. And in this instance, it's not that, you know, if they pick up a rock and it's round and then they put their chisel against it and they make it a square, then in their mind, they made it better. And then they've done something to, look good, I made something better than what you made. And that's the whole problem with mankind, is like they think that they can do something that's more, they have more intelligence, more knowledge, more power than God alone, but yet they think they can do something to impress him. And he's like, look, don't touch it, it's mine, it's perfect the way it is. If it's square when you pick it up, leave it square. If it's round, leave it round, because you can't do anything above me.
Right.
I am God.
But within that, there's still the genuineness of the reason behind doing it is because we think that that's what he would like. And that's something I believe that's important for us to remember anytime we're talking with someone about the gospel, anytime we're talking with someone about Jesus. I firmly believe probably like 98, 99% of the people we talk to are genuine in why they do what they do. They're honest and sincere in that. They're not doing this because they just want to stick it to God. They just want to stick it to the man. No, they're doing it because, back to Dina's point earlier with Saul, they think it's what God wants. So we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to help show them the truth. When we're doing these things, that we have to be humble enough to recognize it, be gentle and patient enough to recognize as well, it's not going to change overnight. We don't change overnight, and we can't expect anyone else to either.
Like I said, it was, you know, humbleness and obedience, that's all he desires.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking to somebody about the gospel, is who are we to think that we're better than the person we're talking to, even if they've never even heard the gospel yet?
Mm-hmm.
Who are we to think we're better than them? That's God's creation, like we said earlier.
Mm-hmm. And that some of that goes back to the verse Martha mentioned earlier out of Proverbs 15 and verse 8. that idea that, yeah, you can sacrifice, but if you're wicked in the sacrifice, you do the right things, you check all the boxes, but your heart's not right, God doesn't like that. God's not going to accept that. So we have to make sure we have the right heart in all that we do for Him. I think I saw Andy and then Jesse.
It kind of makes me laugh a little bit, the comment that Paul made about us thinking, trying to impress God. It's like us, if you've got little kids or had little ones, it's your child bringing something to you that they have utterly destroyed it. I made it better, Daddy, because I have painted your whatever or whatever. It's that childish mentality. It's pure and it's innocent.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make you happy. I want to impress you. But at the same time, it's not what I really need you to do.
Yeah.
My expensive whatever it was
Yeah.
you just destroyed. It's the same thing. It's, we have to understand that we are childish compared to God's intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to get past what we think and what our emotion, the direction it leads us, that we're trying to impress God. God's impressed by our obedience, not trying to one-up or do better. It's doing what is prescribed.
I heard it described one time as essentially, I think, especially like this time of year, you got your kids who are going to like preschool and elementary school, and they come home with like the ugliest Christmas ornament ever and all the popsicle sticks glued and so much glitter, and it's supposed to be a reindeer, but you really can't tell that. It just looks like an alien, right? But your kid is so proud of it because they did this, and they're an artist, and we put the smile on and say, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. We don't sit there and say, hey, you didn't even get this in the lines right. The eyes are like oblong and they're not actually a circle. And we don't sit there and criticize. No, we recognize they're doing the best they can, and we see how proud they are of it. But really and truly, is that not what our obedience and what our offerings look like so often to God? We think it's the best thing ever, but really at the end of the day, we're no different than that child. We're just doing the best that we can. And that's important for us to remember. We're not Picasso. We're the kid at daycare putting the ornament together. Jesse, I saw your hand, but I heard that bell, and I want to try to at least get through the rest of what I've got here on this thought with making excuses, not making excuses. As disciples, we can't use self-doubt as an excuse. A lot of times, this is probably going to be one of the primary ways that we try to get out of doing what we need to be doing as disciples, is because of different elements of self-doubt. I'm going to look at a few verses going back in Exodus, if you're still there. Turn to Exodus chapter 3. And Moses is a good example for us to look at to see how self-doubt is not going to get us out of doing what God would have us to do. Exodus chapter 3, when God is calling Moses from the burning bush, telling Moses, go get my people out of Egypt. And Moses just shows multiple times, I don't think I'm the right guy for that. And what does God tell him every time? No, you're the guy. Get to Egypt. Get my people out of there. Exodus chapter 3, someone read verse 11.
But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?
Doubting my significance isn't going to change what God expects me to do. God says, go rescue my people, and what's Moses say? Who am I to do that? Who am I that you would ask me to do that? Now, yes, we could say, okay, that's a form of humility. Moses was a humble, he was a meek man, that's true. But I think perhaps in the way that Moses continues to make excuses shows maybe there's a little more to this than just humility right now. Who am I? And God says, you're the one. But go to Exodus 3, someone read verse 13.
Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?
Doubting my knowledge isn't going to get me out of obeying God. Moses says, okay, so I'll go, and then they're going to ask me, okay, but who is it that sent you, and what am I going to say to them? What if they even ask me what your name is? What do I tell them? Doubting my knowledge isn't going to get me out of being an obedient disciple. Someone go now to Exodus chapter 4 and verse 1.
Then Moses answered and said, But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, The Lord has not appeared to you.
What ifs aren't going to get me out of being obedient. You realize what Moses is doing right here? Okay, God, okay, I will go, I will obey, I will do what you ask me to, but suppose when I get there, they don't actually believe me and they don't listen to me. Just what if they don't actually listen? What if they don't do? And what's God tell Moses? Quit assuming things. Quit going through the what ifs and all the hypotheticals. Just go. Another place we can look, Exodus 4, someone read verse 10.
Moses said,
Then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue.
And then read verse 13.
But he said, O my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send.
Doubting my abilities is not going to excuse me from being obedient. Moses said, I'm slow of speech, I'm not eloquent of tongue. That's always interesting because who's he telling these things to? The one that made his tongue. He says, God, you expect me to go do this, but I'm not able to do it. No, God wouldn't ask if he knew that you weren't capable. God has asked a lot of us as disciples. And guess what? He does so because he knows that we are capable. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7, God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it's not that we are sufficient of anything in and of ourselves, but we are sufficient for the ministry that God has given us, because God himself has supplied us for the work. God wouldn't ask us to do it if he knew that we were not capable. We cannot make excuses and expect to still be pleasing and obedient to God as disciples. And we'll stop there for this morning, and Lord willing, we'll pick up next time looking at how it is that our obedience to God means that we do not argue with God.